This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Chris and I are going to tap into and lean into Frank's cop background with a show today of our favorite police movies, cop movies. In these movies, we get crime, we get punishment, we get drama, and really everything else you want from entertainment out of these great movies. And I think we will eventually discuss the corollary of the cop movie, the corollary to the cop movie genre, the cop television procedural. That's a different episode for a different day. Before we dive into it, I'll share a little anecdote I had about police movies. I was I was at a party with a friend of mine, and he had all of his cop buddies there. And I just asked, I was like, what do you think about cop movies? And they all kind of like groaned because they did cop stuff all day. They didn't really want to go and watch it as entertainment. And I wonder, what do you feel about that when you watch them? Are you able to watch them and kind of separate the professional side of you and just enjoy them?
Yeah, I always was. I mean, I used to joke that when you're trying to get on the job and in your first year on the job, you would watch the TV show Cops all the time when you were off duty. And then by the time you've been on the job for about a year, you never watch it again in your life unless it's a training video at the academy or something that they use because it's a busman's holiday. But it's not the same is not true with good television shows, and definitely not with good movies. I always enjoyed a good police related movie. I mean, I got to be particular about mistakes at times, although, you can overlook that if the story's good and all that. But just like any profession, you pick out the things that aren't real. But it wasn't ruined for me at all. I still enjoyed good police movies. I think I hated bad movies that were police related more after I came on the job than I did before, but I still loved good cop movies.
So we're going to start right with you, Frank. What are your top cop movies?
Well, I only picked two for the purposes of this discussion, just to keep things from going on for 6 hours, because we all love this topic so much. And so just picking two picking 20 would be easier. But I decided to go with the Two Coasts of Corruption. I went with Copland, which is set in New York and New Jersey. And I went with Training Day, which is set in Los Angeles. So completely over on the other side of the country.
So why don't you start off with which I could talk about Copland all day, and eventually we'll have an episode that Chris and I did on Copland. Let it rip with which one you want to go with.
Well, I mean, before I get into either one, I think pointing out that both of them have some similar themes is interesting to me. I mean, both of them feature corruption, both at the individual and the systemic level. All of these cops are working within a broken system. And then at the same time, they also have cops within the system who are trying to play within the rules and or bring down the bad guys. I mean, in Copland, you've got obviously Freddie, the character played by Stallone. He's trying to do the right thing, and he idolizes all those other cops, and he's trying to be a good cop. And then in Training Day, you've got Officer Hoyt, played by Ethan Hawke, who is trying like hell to impress this, narcotics sergeant so he can make the team and take the next step in his career. But when he figures out what's actually going on, he rejects it and he tries to do the right thing. So even though they explore corruption and as a police officer, and having been around cops, like I said, I mean, all over the US and Canada, it was always the same thing. They hated to hear about, corruption, and they didn't like to see it in movies and stuff. But when you have some balance in it, I think it makes for a much better film.
I mean, we did a podcast on Copland, right? And to be honest with you, when we did record that podcast, I hadn't watched in a really long time, and so long, to be honest with you, was I just knew it's like, oh, this was like the Stallone doing the serious movie type thing, or doing like the role that he typically doesn't do. And then when we watched it for the podcast, I watched it several times, and like I was blown away by just how well done it was, and in particular his acting. And then Training Day, I find it's weird because at the beginning of the movie, you kind of like Denzel Washington's character to a degree.
Kind of. Come on, you felt
you know
admit
what I
it.
mean?
You fell in love with him. You wanted to have his children at the beginning of the movie.
And then you see, though, like you kind of see slowly, like it's like a peeling of an onion, right? Like, and which is kind of how corruption itself actually works, right? There's like the surface level of it, and it's, oh, you don't think much of it. It's like, oh, it's something you can just kind of overlook, right? Like, oh, like my girlfriend doesn't like folding the laundry or something like that. It's not a big deal, right? But then you peel another piece, and it's like, oh, okay, this is making me question a little bit, right? And then you peel another piece, and then by the time you get to it, you see at the end of it just how disgustingly corrupt Denzel Washington is. And even within like a community that pretty much functions on criminality, they're like, we can't even deal with this guy anymore. That's how corrupt he was. And in a lot of ways, it shows like how corruption affects the individual, but it also affects the entire community that it's being perpetrated on.
And then Copland. I mean, with Copland, I think that one of the themes that keeps coming through with me is Freddie always felt like he won the not even the second place prize. He thought he won the third place prize, that he was in the minor leagues, that he could only define himself as if he was a New York City cop, because all those other people in all the other New York City cops, I mean, it was like he didn't even exist because he wasn't on the force. And that whole thing that he could be who he was in his role. I mean, it's almost for a police procedural movie. You almost can't leave that movie without a tear in your eye.
Oh, for sure. For several characters. And the interesting thing about the character of Freddie that Stallone plays, I think you hit it right on the head. He sees the major league as being an NYPD officer. And because he did the right thing, he saved a woman's life, at jumping into the water and rescuing her, and had his eardrum busted permanently as a result. And now he can't be an NYPD police officer. He sees that, as the pinnacle, and he's in the minors. He's a AA player at best in his mind. And they prey on that. These few officers who are corrupt. I mean, I'm not going to tell you, oh, it's just NYPD. Hell no. Of course it's not. But these officers are corrupt in this movie, and Harvey Keitel and all of them. He's kind of the ringleader. They prey on his psychosis. They prey on the psychology that he's going through and give him what he wants, even though it's, only a shadow of what he wants. And I think that kind of manipulative behavior, I mean, that's very mob-like, isn't it, guys? I mean, isn't that what you see in that setting as well?
I think that's exactly what they were going for in that movie. It was a mob, like a mafia of cops, right? Within their own version of the Omerta, where nobody talked. And if you were going to talk, they were going to kill you, which is what happened to Ray Liotta's partner. It's not made. I can't remember if it was made explicit in the movie, but it was hinted at that that's what Harvey Keitel's character did, is, took care of him before he talked, right? The interesting thing about Copland too, and you mentioned Freddie's character, is, yeah, he's a small town cop, like in a sheriff in a small town. But in terms of fighting corruption, it really does start at that level. It starts with just your regular everyday Joe saying, like, we're not doing this anymore. And people say, like, oh, what's that going to do? It's just like one person. But like one person kind of setting an example inspires other people to do things too. And then before you know it, it's not just a couple of people doing it. It's a bunch of people doing it. And once it's a bunch of people talking about it, then something has to be done about it. are you going to solve police corruption by doing that? No, you're not going to solve it, but you can stop it with maybe in that circumstance. And it's a never ending battle. It sounds cliche, but liberty's not free. Like you have to constantly fight for it. And in terms of fighting corruption in the police force or in our government agencies, you have to constantly fight against it, because otherwise you have what happens in Copland, where you have this little cadre of mafia cops, is basically what I would call them, running the show and doing just horrible things to fellow cops and the community around them.
Ironically, that sort of participation and vigilance and shining some light on behavior is the exact same formula for trying to stop crime. Community involvement and people being willing to testify and shining a light on it and so forth. And it's also a never-ending battle. I mean, you're never going to, as a police officer, you're never going to show up at work and see the chief locking the front door and say, "What's going on?" We're done. Crime's done. We're finished. Go find a new job. That's never going to happen, right? So it's interesting to hear you describe that, and that's what's going through my mind is, that's exactly the same formula for fighting crime. It's persistence and ethical awareness and people being willing to make a difference. Quickly though, let's not dump, and I know neither of you were intending to, but let's not dump on small town cops at all. I mean, the reality is the majority of police are on a medium to small sized police department. In the U.S. anyway, the majority of cops serve on a department that's medium sized or less. I don't remember what number defines that, but we're not talking about hundreds of people in that size of an agency. And there is a different form of policing that takes place. That might be a different discussion for a different day. But when you're a county detective with backup 30 minutes out, it's a little bit different style of policing than what we saw in Copland, where when the guy's fighting on the roof, there's 12 guys coming in squad cars, a minute and a half away. So just something to think about out there, folks. It's a different sort of world depending on where and how you end up policing.
To bounce off of that, I think that's what Copland set the dichotomy so well of, that the city is always in the background. And as far as I know, there's no place in New Jersey that's a small village, essentially right across the street or right across the river from the city. But they got that so well that the small town versus the big city, even if it doesn't actually exist in reality, to draw that really stark dichotomy. It wouldn't have been the same if they lived 3 hours away in Pennsylvania, where it would really have been that way, to show this is their town. That's right on the river. And you can see the city in the backdrop. I think that was one of the most clever things of the movie, is it always kept it in your mind.
Yeah, it did. And you always knew that dichotomy was very starkly drawn and constantly reinforced. And I thought they did a tremendous job of that. It does. Well, I'll talk about this more when we get to training day, but it does bring up the issue of how, like, those cops from New York, in addition to how Freddie saw them, they kind of saw themselves as elite and for being part of NYPD, and a certain amount of entitlement came with that. And I think some of that was bred from the corruption that they were enjoying. And also, of course, like I said, for being part of the A team, essentially. And of course, that's not a good trait, right? That's not something that we admire, but these same guys are dealing with stuff in the city every day, that is horrible, right? They're in the trenches up to their knees, battling through the muck and the mire of that job. And it's not like that every day. It's not like that all day long every day, but it's like that most days, some of the day, if that makes sense. And when you experience that day after day after day after day, even if you work in a decent city, it's still, you're dealing with the underworld of that city, essentially the under parts of it, people at their worst or the worst people, depending. So what do you end up wanting as an individual? You want your family to not experience that. And one way that you don't experience that is if you don't live in the same place. And so a lot of cops live out in the suburbs. They live somewhere else. Like these cops, they lived in Garrison, New Jersey, which I assume is a made up town, or at least was depicted fictionally. A nice town where people can, not lock their doors and all that, and all that kind of stuff. And that's great. Everybody wants something better for their families, and I'm all for it. But it has an interesting side effect. And I don't know if this really came out so much in Copland, but the danger of it was right there. And that is when you don't live where you police, and where you live is dramatically different than where you police, then there is a loss of connectivity with your community that you're policing. There's a loss of understanding. There's a detachment that takes place, and that can lead to more distance. And anytime there's distance between the police and the community that they serve, it's never good. It's not, necessarily doesn't cause corruption necessarily, but it does make policing more difficult. If you disconnect from the community disconnects from you, and suddenly people aren't calling when things happen. They're not testifying. They're not, willing to go as far in terms of being a witness. Programs that you might try to start to make things better get lukewarm reception and maybe not the greatest level of involvement. Everybody's been in a relationship where the other person checked out, and you can figure out that we're not going to be friends anymore, or we're not going to date anymore pretty soon because they're already gone, right? There's even an Eagles song about it. So I would hum it here, but you'd get struck on a copyright violation, so I won't do it. But the community can sense that from an agency too. And so when you see these guys set up over in Garrison, and you see what kind of junk they have to deal with in the city, you can kind of understand their desire to do that, to have a better life. And I get that. I totally get that. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have done that. But I think it does bring a whole new set of problems with it that can be bad. It can be bad for a community. So, that's just one of the things I noticed that I didn't really think about when I watched it the first 12 or 13 times, but when I watched it recently, I did. It occurred to me because I was in a different place experientially, and so those are some of the thoughts that go through my head. So I don't know. Does this concept make sense, or am I barking up a deaf tree?
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
To me, you basically described about communities not feeling like a connection to the police force or the state authorities. You basically set up the scenario in which the mafia can thrive. That's exactly how it happened in New York, in places like Brownsville, where, a lot of the times we just finishing our series on Murder Inc. And a lot of the time was they didn't trust the cops. They grew up in poverty. They didn't trust the government either, right? Because they lived in some of the worst conditions in, the modern world at the time, in the world, you could argue too, because of how cramped the spaces were and the lack of sanitation. They just looked at all authorities and be like, we don't trust any of them. So even if a cop wanted to go in there and try to make a difference, good luck. It's just not going to happen. And then who comes in and replaces that? The authority that the state and the police force is supposed to have. It becomes the gangs, really. It's like, oh, you don't want your shop burned down? Well, you got to pay this tax for us, right? Otherwise, this is going to happen to your shop, or this is what's going to happen to your brother. Oh, you need a loan to get something? Oh, come to me. Here's the problem, though. It's like, we're going to charge you 40%, interest. And if you don't pay, if you don't even cover the VIG payments, we're going to break your fingers and beat your wife up. And that's exactly,
doesn't that come later though, Chris? Doesn't it start with, oh, that guy Steve is messing with you? I'll take care of it. Mm-hmm. That's what it starts with. And then it's like, then it gets to the, probably you should just give me some money to take care of it on an ongoing basis for you. And then, but it almost like we talked about noble cause corruption on a different episode about how cops start doing the wrong thing for the right reason, basically to put bad guys in jail, the guys they know are very bad in jails, so they don't get off on a technicality. That might be the first transgression that happens, but then it progresses because it can be a slippery slope. I think the same thing's true in the mob, isn't it? I mean, even if you go back to Italy, they brought order and they brought resolution to problems. They brought safety to people initially. And then, of course, it became corrupt, and it became, extortion, and it became, all the other bad things that the mob does. So it's interesting. Basically, human nature is human nature, I think, is what it comes down to.
I think so much of what you said, too, about the sense of community, where if you are living in the community, like I've seen it in a slightly different way of teaching in the neighborhood school, where my kids went to that school, their friends went to school. And it even in that situation, there were some really awesome things about it. It really did. It broke down some of those barriers of the authority and this, and, you became friends with the parents. They were your neighbors. They were your shopkeepers, the person who did your brakes, everybody was leveled out the playing field in a lot of ways. But then it did also cause some awkwardness where you could see where some of that noble corruption could sneak in. Oh, can I really give so-and-so's kid a bad grade when they're, a good friend, or getting cornered. Oh, can you talk about this or that? And I think with police, it would get amped up even more, because do you really want to live in a neighborhood where you could be potentially, especially in maybe a higher crime neighborhood where you might have to be locking up a lot of people? I think there could be a lot of really good benefits to that, and there could be a lot of really negative outcomes. And I could see where some people want to keep a separation there.
But the thing is that, it's easy to think of a person as a stereotype. Oh, he's an Italian. Oh, he's whatever, an Irishman. Oh, she's French or whatever. He's a teacher. She's a cop. He works at a recycling plant. You can just decide that's the stereotype, and you can, really easily decide how you want to feel about that person. But when the person is an individual, it's a lot harder to sell yourself on anything that isn't true. That's not, that's not accurate. And so one of the things that's great about community policing, or whatever iteration they're calling it at this stage now, I've been out of the game for a decade, neighborhood policing, whatever you want to call it, is that now people know Steve, not Officer Guerra, mm-hmm. right? They know Chris, not Officer Daniels. They know Frank, not Sergeant Scalise. I put myself in charge because I have more experience. So problem solving is different when you know somebody, even a little bit, even if you have the tiniest bit of commonality. And so that's the benefit of being within the community. So when you don't have that, you have to, as a police officer, you have to, hopefully you do anyway, you have to try to discover that commonality. If they've got a picture, if they've got Native American picture up on the wall, and you are also, maybe that's your history area, then you can, broach that topic. I'm not talking about the middle of a drag out fight, but you're there on a call, right? Anything to create commonality, because then the problem solving becomes easier. And I think in Freddie's case, that would have been all of the policing that he did. He knew everybody in that town. Everybody knew him. But in New York, these guys live in Garrison. They're only there when they're working. They're in cars. They're not walking a beat. I don't know that it necessarily is quite as effective. It may, I may be a little pie in the sky. We're never going to go back to Officer Joe on the beat. But boy, if we could find a way to bridge the gap between where we are and that, I think we'd be in a better place when it comes to policing and everything that surrounds it. The effectiveness of the police corruption or scandals when they do happen, people's quality of life. It would be more like Garrison, New Jersey, where these guys want to live, than it would be in some of the rougher places in New York.
Let's shift gears to training day. And how does that fit in?
It's a lot the same, I think. And that's kind of why I picked it. The biggest difference, though, is so the corruption that's taking place in Copland is a reaction to the policing life and a desire for a better life. And then it becomes about self-aggrandizement and, self-enrichment as well. But that's where it starts. And that's mostly what it's about. in Training Day, Alonzo Harris does what he does to put bad guys in jail. That's his creed, right? That's what he does. I mean, when Ethan Hawke calls him on it, he gets offended and he lists out judges have given out this ungodly number of years of prison sentences on cases that he's worked. And everything he's doing is about either putting bad guys into jail or bettering the life of the community that he's policing. Even if sometimes that community is, as Chris very rightfully pointed out, just beset with criminality. I mean, he's crooked, but I don't know that he's a completely bad guy. I mean, one thing that people need to remember when they watch that movie is the actions he takes during that day is actually a response to the fact that he went to Vegas and popped off his mouth and lost some money and made the Russians mad, and they put out a hit on him, and he was trying to buy off the hit. And so he does a lot of corrupt things, a lot of very corrupt things, but essentially it's to save his own life is how he sees it. I'd be curious to see a different Training Day where maybe before he went to Las Vegas, how similar it would be. It would be very similar up to a point because his habits and his behaviors were what he did all the time. It was clear. But his attitude was, you got to be a wolf to catch a wolf, and that's not an uncommon attitude among a lot of police. And I don't know that it's a wrong attitude entirely. One of my favorite television seasons, probably the best season of television of all time, is True Detective season 1, in my humble opinion. And there's a line in there where one character is feeling bad about some decisions that he's made, and he asks the other character, the Matthew McConaughey character, Russ Cole, do you ever think you're a bad man? And Russ tells him, the people need bad men, Marty. We keep the other bad men from the door. I mean, that's almost word for word, beat for beat. You got to be a wolf to catch a wolf from Training Day. And so this corruption is more based on what they're trying to accomplish. And I want to touch on that a little more deeply, but I don't want to go too far too fast.
How many times have me and you argued about this, Steve, where there's a part of me that's just like, you know what, like you go into places like Baltimore and Detroit, and it's just like, you know what, you're not going to fix this problem. Like, and you need a sledgehammer to actually fix this problem. And at the end of the day, like sometimes people, it gets almost, well, some people willingly take the burden, but in a lot of ways it can be a burden. It's like, I have to be the sledgehammer because who else is going to be the sledgehammer in the face of this absolute like debauchery and criminality that's going on in this community. Like I have to, at least if I can stop it here, or at least I can keep it from spreading in other places. And Steve, you have more so like a libertarian bent. So you're always terrified of, the state having too much power or organizations having too much power. And I mean, I get it, like to a degree where I'm like, I see the problems with that, right? My opinion's always been like, well, if they start having a problem, then the people can just get rid of the people that are causing the problem. But I don't know, I go back and forth with it all the time where it's just like, in some ways I understand Denzel's character where it's just like, yeah, like if you're going to fight a bunch of wolves, like you have to be the biggest, baddest wolf to be able to tame all these wolves, right? And I think some people, they don't get it fully. Like I grew up in Toronto, so I didn't grow up in a place like Detroit or anything like that, right? But I grew up like a lot of my friends ended up becoming criminals and stuff like that. And then you're around these people and you're dealing with this. And there's a lot of eye in the pie type solutions to these problems, I find, where people are like, well, if you just do this and you do this, and if the cops did this, and I'm like sometimes it literally takes a billy bat across the face and like arresting people, like just literally removing the problem for the community to even have a chance. But I mean, that's probably a really controversial opinion, but that's how I feel sometimes. But I understand the concern of, police using excessive force or the state using excessive force, because in a lot of ways it's cliche, but it's the truth, right? In a lot of ways, they're the most powerful mafia, they can print their own money, they have their own army.
But people, it's funny because if somebody goes zooming down your block and then a police car goes zooming after him and stops him and writes him a ticket, you're cheering, right? Write that mother a ticket, write that Humpty Humper a ticket, right? You're all, and that extends too. If some guy's being a total jackwagon at a bar or something and takes a poke at somebody and shows up and mounts off to the cops and takes a swing at the cops and gets pig piled, as we used to call it. And, ends up on the ground with, about 6 knees holding him down and gets cuffed up and thrown in a car and taken to jail. People probably cheer the car as it drives away. I mean, people's sense of justice is pretty well, unless you start having philosophical discussions with them, but the in the moment sense of justice is pretty well developed. It's pretty keen. And so the question that comes to me with this movie Training Day is, he's engaged in corrupt behavior. That's one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin is how much of society is willing to accept that behavior in order to get the result. Like when we talked about noble cause corruption, a lot of times it goes, when it goes off the rails and goes really far, you've got absentee leadership that's really not paying attention to anything except the results. Drugs and money on the table, stats, arrests, community happy about whatever. The community is kind of the same way, I think, about some things. If the cops are getting it done, they almost don't care, it's just a bunch of criminals. I mean, if somebody happened to get smacked upside the head, when they didn't deserve it, I can live with that sort of attitude, I think. And so in this movie, it just makes me think about the question, what does society want? They want justice. At what cost? And everybody's answer is different, of course, right? If we polled the 3 of us, we'd have 3 different answers. If there were 300 people on this broadcast, there'd be 300 different answers where that line is at. And Training Day does a really good job of, I think, drawing you in. You talked about liking Alonzo, and I teased you about loving him. I loved him. Like, he's the coolest dude ever it's a 2-hour movie, and for 90 minutes, he's a god. He's funny, he's charming. Denzel's a handsome man, obviously. He's a good-looking guy, so he's very charismatic, very cinematic. And what he's doing makes sense to your basic sense of justice, doesn't it? Did he do anything that you thought was over the top until when? When did he do something that you felt was too far? Probably when he faked the search warrant to steal the money from that woman who had the kid and did the fake raid. Do you remember that part there? That was probably where most people go, oh, I think I'm out. I think he's a bad guy now. But prior to that, most people were probably like, yeah, well, that guy, he tried to rape that girl in the alley. So he got whacked in the groin by the butt of a gun. He's lucky that he didn't go to jail or get one of those, get it shot off or something. Right. And so where's that line? And they do a really good job, I think, of taking you down the road and seeing how far down that road you'll go with them before you look for an exit.
Yeah, you mentioned about how far would we be willing to go? If somebody told me, and this is just all theoretical, right? It's hey, in your neighborhood, we can get rid of all the fentanyl, we can get rid of all the crack, get rid of all the meth, right? We just gonna have to be allowed to do this, this, and this, and this. If they provided the results, I'd be like, it's not a bad deal. And there's a part of me that goes that's not a bad deal.
But what's this, and this? What would you?
Yeah, that kind of.
Therein lies the rub.
But to me, it's if you got the results, there's no fentanyl on the streets anymore. There's no meth. There's no
so crack. I'm gonna assassinate every drug dealer until all of them leave the neighborhood. Are you okay with that? That's a long pause. That's a long pause, Chris.
I just don't know what I should say because I know what my answer is, but
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I started at the wrong end of the spectrum, Steve. I should have started with, I'm going to go and verbally harangue all the drug dealers.
To me, I'd be yeah, it's perfectly fine. Shoot the drug dealers. I don't
But
care.
What if you dial it back a notch and you just, the team is around the table and they say that it's the people who are doing this are predominantly teenagers from the age of 17 to 23 and they're of a certain race. Is it okay to roust every single person of that fits that profile? Is that would that be acceptable? And shake them down no matter what? Like basically essentially profiling.
I mean, in our democratic country with civil rights, and I mean, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. No, but in a place like Singapore, they don't care, and they don't have drugs on the streets like we do. It's just
and police they profile behavior more than anything. So, if those individuals of whatever age group or whatever demographic, racially or whatever, if they're on a known drug corner making frequent contacts with people coming and going, that's the focus, right? Not necessarily the other factors. But I think your point, Steve, is a wonderful one, because it really clearly defines what we're talking about here. You're giving up some freedoms, and not your own, by the way, somebody else's, in order for everybody to have safety. And how much of that are you willing to do? And in the movie, I think that's kind of what we have to ask ourselves. They're trying to get drugs off the street. Well, what are you willing to do that? Are you willing to allow a guy like Scott Glenn's character to basically operate unimpeded for years because he gives you information and he doesn't sell to kids, and he has this code that you're okay with? Is that acceptable? Because you're never going to get drugs off the street, right? So why not try to control it a little bit? Now I'm being rhetorical here. I'm not actually saying that's what we should do, but some people would be like, yeah, that's a necessary evil. That was a smart play on their part. Is that okay? I mean, there's a lot of questions that it brings up, and I think it's a fantastic movie from that perspective too.
And it's a never ending discussion, honestly. Like, I go back and forth with it all the time. But I'm not going to lie. Like, I kind of lean towards stuff, especially with like drug related and, stuff like murder and stuff like that, like really serious crimes. I mean, do what's necessary to get the stuff off the streets. People talk about like in terms of drug use, and like a lot of times, like I think there's certain people that just kind of gravitate towards it. But there's also people that are just like, they're at a party and they try something and they're hanging out with a couple of people and they try it a couple more times. And then all of a sudden they're hooked, and if that just wasn't, and if that was difficult to get, which is unlike what goes on in society now, if that was actually somewhat difficult to get for the average person, a lot of those scenarios just wouldn't happen.
I think what you describe is that for the most part, drug use, more than the physical effects of addiction, is it's habitual. And a lot of the research shows that is when people get into drugs, it's a habit and it's their lifestyle. And it's a lot of the best programs that get people off of drugs. I interviewed another author, Sam Quinones, who was really a big fan of a program in, I want to say it was somewhere in Appalachia, where he said that they put people in prison and they had guards and psychologists who just trained people on how to operate in a society where they're not on drugs.
Well, I don't want to spend all the time on just these two movies. So before we move on, I do want to ask everybody favorite quotes from each movie, favorite lines. Copland, Steve.
Without a doubt, it would have to be, there's so many of them that I use. In for a penny, in for a pound, Ray. But the diagonal rule, following, you can follow somebody from ahead of them as much as you can from tailing them. And then, I might be stealing somebody else's, is being right isn't a bulletproof vest. Oh my goodness. I tell
Ray Liotta, does he not own that line?
I don't think that's the best line in Copland. That is the best line. That's a motto you should live by. Being right is not a bulletproof vest.
And he delivers it with such so emphatically and with frustration too. It's like he's trying to get somebody to understand, being right isn't a bulletproof vest, Freddie, and he comes at him hard with it, and that is my favorite line. But I will take another one then. because Robert De Niro has a very understated but extremely important role in this movie. And, I go to lunch, and he freaks out and everything. And when Stallone comes back and tries to give him the information now, and he's got the sandwich and he's like not worried about it anymore. And he goes, we came to you, and he goes, you had a chance to do something and you blew it. And just the way that De Niro delivers that line and he's waving the sandwich, it's like, it's great. I really enjoyed that line. Do you have a favorite line from the movie, Chris?
Not so much a line, I'd say more so a scene. I think it's when Ray Liotta's character comes over to Frank's place and he's laying low for a bit, and Frank realizes like Ray Liotta's character's doing blow in the bathroom, like his own bathroom.
Oh yeah,
and it's just kind of like a realization where Frank has such a good
Freddie. Sorry. Freddie has such a good moral compass in the sense like this is wrong. But I think it's like a revelation to him to a degree where it's like, sometimes, you know what, I have to work with people that might not necessarily be as good as me or have the same moral compass as me to achieve a better good. And just because somebody might be bad in this scenario, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're entirely bad, which is, kind of what we find out during the movie, right? And that's pretty much real life too, in a lot of ways. I have a very strong sense of right and wrong, a moral compass. Now, I might not be right about that all the time, but to me, it's pretty strong. Like it doesn't fluctuate all that much, but sometimes I have to catch myself where I'm judging somebody because they're doing something wrong and think to myself, I'm like, well, I got to be able to be a little bit flexible here sometimes, and I just think Freddie has to be too, doesn't he? He washes it off the mirror. He doesn't confront him. He doesn't arrest him. He shows that he's able to, that's corrupt. That's a little corrupt. He shows that he's not a perfect individual. And I love that about the movie because it shows that it's not a light switch. There are degrees of somebody being corrupt in whatever profession that they're in. And Freddie's at the very light end of the spectrum, but that's still a corrupt thing. He also knew Figsy blew up his own house. He might not have been able to prove it, but he knew it and he didn't say anything. So, he had a little bit of corruption too, just not enough to allow somebody to get killed. So, he wasn't going to let him murder Superboy. Right. So,
I think
that's a great scene. That's a good.
I think just a part of it too is where, unlike say like the other characters, or they see the corruption and it doesn't, like they know that they're being corrupt and it's not affecting them, where you can see that it's literally eating Freddie away inside, that he is participating in this.
Yeah.
He's
conflicted with it,
and I have no choice, right? And I think that was the biggest difference to me. Like, and that scene kind of perfectly represents it. And to me, that's what separated him the most from all the other characters, where like a lot of the corruption, it wasn't eating away at the other guys, where Freddie was, you can literally see it on his body. I think that's why Stallone gained weight for the role. And, he didn't look as jacked as he usually did, because I think he was physically showing that the corruption was literally eating away at him. And if he didn't do something about it, eventually maybe he would have killed himself. I don't know.
Well, that is a very insightful view of that character and that scene. I don't think a lot of people would have picked that scene as being as pivotal as you've pointed it out to be. But I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I do, before we move on to Training Day quotes, I did want to point out Ray Liotta's character, Figsy, he has a little bit of a redemption arc too. So you've got the cops who are outright corrupt, and you've got Freddie who's outright not, just a maybe slightly tiny bit flawed. And then you got Figs, who is one of them, but now he's trying to get out, and he's got to decide if he's going to do what's best for him or if he's going to do the right thing. And he backs Freddie up and he does the right thing. And so to me, that's a redemption arc. And I think I think that sends a pretty powerful message too. But Training Day, favorite quote from Training Day. Chris, do you want to start since you had to go third last time?
The King Kong quote. That's the best line in the entire movie, right? Like it's it's just so, I don't know, it's just so badass, but it's not badass at the same time, because it's, I don't know, it's this guy's like making one last stand, and in some ways it's pretty pathetic too, right? Where he's just like, I run this neighborhood, I'm King Kong. And it's just like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
You know, like you're a guy, you pointed out, you're a guy, you know, made some bad bets and ran his mouth off, and you've been trying to save your life this entire time. You know, you're not King Kong. You know, King Kong doesn't have to worry about this type of stuff. You know, like it really kind of encapsulates just how delusional Denzel Washington is about the character, like it just about himself, really. But the way he delivers it is perfect. I mean, it's like one of the best scenes in, I don't know, cops behaving badly type movie. You know, that's my opinion. I was glad you asked me, because I know one of you guys were probably going to pick that scene too. So I snagged that one.
Frank, what do you think?
I like to protect the sheep, you got to catch the wolf, and it takes a wolf to catch a wolf. I think that's a good one. I love it when he tells the stupid suburban kid, you know, I will slap the taste out of your mouth. You know what I mean? I think that's a really, really good. But I think that my favorite is when he says, well, I love the King Kong quote too, by the way, Chris, but I didn't want to steal yours. I think when he says, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And that's the creed that he says several times. And it's an interesting piece of his character because it works on the positive side. You know, you might know a guy is guilty. Doesn't matter. You have to be able to prove it. On the flip side, they might know you're corrupt, but they have to be able to prove it. So we got some room to tell a different story here. So the quote, is ambidextrous, right? It applies to both, the law and the corruption. So, but there's so many of them. He's got so many good lines in there. I mean, the scene at the diner is fantastic. The scene where he makes him smoke dope, and it's well done.
The craziest thing about Training Day I find too, is just like, it's literally a one-man show in a lot of ways. Like Ethan Hawke's character is there, but it's like literally Denzel Washington is just, his character runs that entire movie. I mean, the only comparison I can kind of think of is like Al Pacino and Scarface, where like everybody else is just there, you're just watching Al Pacino doing Tony Montana, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a noticeable difference in the tone of the movie once the focus shifts strictly onto Jake. I mean, it's like 60-40, 65-35 on Alonzo and then Jake, because you're seeing Alonzo through Jake's eyes. But then it shifts after that, after he tries to have him whacked by the Mexican gang or the Hispanic gang. So, yeah. So, Steve, yours.
I mean, I think you guys really encapsulated the best ones out of the whole movie.
Kind of bogarted them, didn't we?
So transitioning to mine, I had probably like Frank, I had about 20, and I'm sure Chris too, about 20 movies I wanted to pick. But as I was sifting through them, I found that there was 3 movies that one almost made the cut, but at the last second I cut it. But I wanted to focus in on crime in LA because I think that some of the best crime movies come out of LA, like Training Day did. But so the 3 that I picked was The New Centurions, and that was from 1972, Colors from 1988, and then Ramparts, which was from 2011. And one thing that I really liked about them is that they one from the 70s that was set in the 70s and made in the 70s, one in the late 80s that was set in the late 80s and then filmed in the late 80s, and then one that was it was set in 2000, or it was actually set in around 1999, but it was filmed a little bit later than that. But I think each one of those movies got the zeitgeist of what was going on. And the other cool thing about each of those 3 movies is they all took place in more or less the same neighborhood of LA. And you could see the transition of how the neighborhood was and how crime, it rose, it fell, it rose, it fell. And I think that arc of those 3 movies is what really attracted me to put those 3 together. They almost form like a 3-movie series.
Oh no, I just said you continue, Steve, because some of these ones I hadn't watched in a long time. I'm not gonna lie, so I'm probably gonna not say as much this time.
And then one other thing that I think that tied them all together is especially The New Centurions and Colors. Well, and then a couple of them had some different connections, but the new Centurion colors had the rookie element and the veteran who took things very lightly. They took their job seriously, but they also took it lightly. And then another development that we're almost seeing the playing out of it now is gang units in LA. So kind of the thing that Chris is talking about, they put an experiment into place where they put these gang units that were very much targeting the people who sold the drugs and in some cases went into assassinations, but that's not really talked about in these movies. But these crash units that the LAPD had, and it really, I think that it shows how those things developed.
Well, the Rampart scandal was involving crash officers when it happened. So it's interesting that two of the movies are related in that way as well. I have not seen the new Centurions film. I read the book way back about the time I was at the 5-year mark. And so I remember thinking how incredibly well Joseph Wambaugh captured those first 5 years. It was a little different in LA, obviously. Every jurisdiction has its own little, differences and it's not exactly the same, but the human behavior is the same and the resulting emotions are the same. So I'd be curious to hear from essentially a civilian, although I would argue your teaching experience actually gives you a pretty strong insight on these phenomena, Steve. But what is it that drew you to that movie?
I loved I'm kind of a sucker for that old timey. It's this, like the 70s but I loved the Kilvinsky character, his arc in there. This is one of those movies that they made in the early 70s that it had on the veneer. It's cheesy, but it's so much better than it even has a right to be. That the Kilvinsky character, he's a great cop. He has some of that corruption. He looks another way, but I think he's always doing it for the right reason. But the thing that I loved the most is that it explored the person Kilvinsky for his 20 or 25 years that he was on the job. He was 100% cop. And then when he retired, he had nothing. Like it evaporated his whole purpose. And I don't think he even realized that would happen. And I wonder from your perspective, it's pretty clear you filled your retirement up, but you must have seen officers who, once they retired, they were rudderless.
Not as often as you might think, but that's because, we've known about things like this Kilvinsky type scenario for, a long time. And so you get warned early on, like, don't make your life all about the job. When you're first on, it's super exciting and it's all consuming and all encompassing. And all you want to do is work. There's a constant or a frequent joke that gets told that there really isn't a joke. When you first come on the job, you run around like crazy and all you can think of is, I can't believe they pay me to do this. And you're just so excited. And then, after about 5 years or more, at some point you reach a point where you say, God, they do not pay me enough to do this. That's the arc of the career, and a lot of people figure out early on, hey, I need to, I need to be involved in other stuff. So I have friends who are, my best friend from the academy, he's into cosplay. He makes cosplay outfits, like really high end ones. I know another guy who plays, a couple of guys who play in different bands. People, they figure that out, but not everybody does, like you point out. And it sometimes even happens while you're still on the job. I knew a guy who was one of those people who his entire identity was wrapped up in being a police officer and being successful at it. And he really wanted to achieve a particular position, and things didn't break right. And it really was through no fault of his own. He deserved the position and he deserved to succeed. He was a good guy and he worked hard and he had morals, but, the fate conspired against him, and a lousy chief came in and kind of screwed him over. And he struggled for a couple of years with with how much that shattered his like sense of self, because he didn't have a lot of other stuff going on. It was all about who he was as a police officer. And when that got rocked, it really shook him. And I think that happens to some people when they retire for sure. But I'm happy to report that I don't think it happens as often as it used to because of, in some cases, you can probably say that Wamba is at least a tiny bit to blame for it not happening as much, or give him credit, I guess I should say. Because fiction, what is fiction but, a lie told to reveal the truth. And by showing this guy, Kilvinsky, and how he's so into it and it's all he is, and then he's just nothing when he's gone. There's a lot of cops that read Joseph Wambaugh. A lot of cops read the New Centurions. A lot of cops read the Choir Boys. There's a lesson learned there just from that. So, but you make a valid point. It's the same with teaching though, right? It's the same with any career, I think.
Yeah, I think a career where you're super invested, you've worked hard to get to that career. It's not something that generally people fall into. It's usually a life pursuit. They get it. And like you said, they go through those arcs in their career. And a lot of people, if they're not careful, like you say, they can become consumed by it. And then once they retire, it's dropped off the cliff. I have seen that in teaching as well. One other thing that I think that they really touched upon, and I think it's, maybe again, this is one that's not as much as it was back then, was it the alcoholism? And Stacy Keach's character, Failer, his alcoholism, he just kind of slid into it. He got home. He was working the night shift, and he got home, and you have a little bit of scotch to get to sleep, and then you still don't really sleep very well. You go to work, you get amped all day during work. You can't, then you can't get home. You can't calm down again. So you have a little more scotch because you need a little bit more. And I can see that must be a very easy thing to slide into with either alcohol or prescription drugs. Could potentially be one too. Just give me one of these sleeping pills so that I cannot be a zombie tomorrow at work.
I would love to address that, but I want to hear what Chris has been wanting to say something for a minute here.
No, I can't say personally, like with police work, and like I'm not a police officer, right? But you're talking about alcoholism and kind of just slipping into it. I mean, I can speak from, we talked a little bit about it on the Leaving Las Vegas podcast, but again, speak from personal experience, working in restaurants for a big chunk of my life. And anyone who's ever worked in restaurants for any length of time knows that just drinking goes hand in hand, like especially you're getting off late at night, everything's closed. What is there to do? Oh, let's all go hang out at the bar and have a drink. And it starts like that. And then some people, they just, restaurant work is just something that they do for a little bit. But then if it's something that you pursue for any length of time, all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's something that you're doing 3-4 days out of the week. But it's been 10 years. And you start associating with things where like, oh, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to go hang out? Oh, that means that we're going to go drinking. And that's how it starts. And it slowly creeps up on you. And then before you even realize it, you're a full blown alcoholic. Like, that's usually how alcoholism works. Like I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and goes, I want to be an alcoholic. It starts off as, a thing here, and then it just slowly gets worse and worse and worse. And then before you know it, you can't go to social events without thinking about drinking. You can't really think about doing anything else really, except for, like, when are we going to go drink? And there's like Nicolas Cage Leaving Las Vegas style alcoholism. And then there's that type of alcoholism, which is much more prevalent, where people literally, they can't think about doing anything else than, like getting home to get a drink. Like if you start thinking like that, you're an alcoholic. You might be only having a couple of drinks, but still, if that's what you're thinking about during the day, it's like, oh, this is so stressful. I can't wait to get home to have a drink. You're an alcoholic. And for cops, I mean, it's understandable. It's like, oh, I saw a crackhead, throw his baby in the microwave. I guess we could have talked about Heat, but like Al Pacino's character says that in the movie Heat. And well, what do you do when you get home? Like, yeah, you're going to get a drink, you just saw that, and then, it just becomes a habit. And you brought it up, Steve, in the previously, where a lot of addiction, it just becomes something that you do. And then before you realize that it's just something that you do, it's a massive problem.
And you really hit on it, Steve. The two of the big reasons that cops drink, one is to calm down after a shift. Not every shift is all jacked up, but a lot of them are, depending on where you work and what shift you work and so forth. So there's that. And then, some of it is to cope. Some of it's self-medication. Some of the stuff you see sucks. And maybe it's a single event like the one that Chris described that Al Pacino talks about in Heat. Maybe it's cumulative. Maybe it's just like the whole last week. Everybody lied. Nobody told me the truth about anything. They wouldn't tell me the sky was blue on a clear day. And I'm just fed up with it. I need a drink. I need to calm down. And then there's the third piece, and that is, celebrating, partying. Cops are people too. They want to party, and just because there's not, in my experience, there's not drugs involved, and I didn't know anybody that did drugs. It was a very, where I came up anyway, it was a very verboten thing. It wasn't treated lightly at all. But drinking's legal. Drinking was legal. And drinking to excess, well, there's no speed limit on how much you can drink. So you can drink as much as you want, right? And so I've been to a lot of parties, and we've drank a lot. And I was probably one of the more mellow guys on that spectrum. But there was a time in my life when I was in command roles that, I was having a drink in the evening, and I was drinking every weekend. And that was, my wife and I are friends with another couple, and they were kind of drinkers. And so we kind of became drinkers to a degree for a good year. I haven't had as many drinks in the last year that I would have had in a week in that time frame. In fact, that friend of mine, he when we were talking about getting the difference between a sergeant and a lieutenant, and we were talking seriously about it, we're having a serious conversation. And then later he comes up to me and hands me a slip of paper, and I open it. In fact, we're in a meeting when he did it. He slides me a piece of paper like passing a note in class or something. And I pop it open, and he's got a list, sergeant on the left and lieutenant on the right. And then he's got brands of liquor, and under sergeant, he'd have like Jose Cuervo. And then under lieutenant, it would be Patron. And then, it would be some cheap, whiskey. And then, I don't know what's good whiskey, Hennessy or something. I don't know. And Stoli would be under the lieutenant, and, something cheap. And the point was, the reason they pay you more as a lieutenant is because you're dealing with more headaches. And so you're going to drink. So you might as well drink a finer brand of alcohol. And it was a pretty funny joke, especially when I'm sitting there in the middle of command staff and the chief's wondering why I'm looking at this note. But that's the thing about alcohol is, for a lot of society, it's free, or it's legal rather, and it's free of stigma for most people. And so cops leaned hard into that, and there was a lot of that release going on. And I don't judge them for it. I did it too, and I understand why. But it's not a new thing. Like you point out, it's in the movie. And I think it's shown, at least if it's anything like it is in the book, it's rather insidious in the way that it's eventually portrayed.
Yeah. And people know too that he's drinking on the job, and that's another thing that I think they explore too, is how much do you cover for somebody, and how much do you have to expose them, because they're putting not only your life on the line, they could potentially be putting the people, obviously somebody who was as drunk as Failer was getting towards the end there. He was putting everybody in a lot of danger with that. And you want to obviously help someone in that condition, but you also need to call them out. And I think they explore it more in the book, the issues around that. But I think you can, the movie invites you to explore that.
Yeah, no way would anybody that I ever worked with put up with that sort of behavior, because officer safety was always the primary consideration. You get home, you get your partner home, you protect the innocent people that you're serving, and it even extended to doing your best to protect the suspect in every situation. but he was the bottom of the list, right? So if somebody was drinking on the job and was intoxicated, that was handled very quickly and very harshly. A lot of the things that you see historically in policing from the 50s, 60s, 70s that were, kind of looked the other way or covered up or just flat out accepted by the time I came on in the early 90s, wasn't tolerated. It just flat out wasn't tolerated. You wouldn't keep your job. And part of the reason is, policing was paying better by the time I came on. It was a career that you could make a good wage at and own a house and take care of a family and one spouse stay home if you wanted to. Certainly you do pretty well if you had a dual income. And when a lot of police corruption started, it started because of a lack of pay for police. That was one consideration back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so, things became normalized, and then we started looking around going, why are we still doing this? There's no reason for it. We're not putting up with this anymore. And we're professionals now. It's a big thing when I was on the job, be a professional. And there's arguments about whether policing is a true profession or not by whose definition. And certainly you can't win that argument with someone if they don't believe so, but there's being a professional and there's behaving like a professional. And you can always do the latter, no matter what job you're in. Right. And so it was a huge emphasis. So like Thaler, he would have been out of the job so fast, and maybe even charged for some of the stuff he did. But definitely out of a job. So when you talked about it going from time period to time period and illustrating the differences within the LA and within the community and society, I think that's a difference between the police. I think certainly by the 1990 film, the one set in 99, he'd be out.
No, it's just interesting. Like I just thought of this right now, and you picked LA kind of as a theme for all your movies. It's interesting to think because LA, you could argue, is probably the youngest big city in the United States. I mean, it really didn't become a big city until when? Like 40s. The 60s, the 50s, really? Because other than that, like, I wonder, it was just an interesting thought I had, like, like all of the cities in the United States are young in comparison to, say, the cities that are in Europe. But, I don't know. I just thought of it now in terms of, the type of, like the type of criminality and stuff that goes on in some of the movies that you're talking about. I wonder if that has any factor into the fact that LA is such a young city and it expanded so quickly.
I've done a little reading into Los Angeles and their policing. And one thing that it seems is they grew up with a very different mindset. I think maybe because they exploded so rapidly that they didn't have a lot of the entrenched interests that a place like New York and Boston. And I think Frank brought this up in the previous episode where there's a lot of institutional baggage that accumulated. LA, at least on paper, they tried to create a very certain type of department that was highly professionalized. I think even down to the uniforms, like they have pretty cool uniforms that are really clean. And I think that they went for an image of, like super professionalism and a small department too, that was kind of in the background, but it would go to the forefront when it needed to. And I think that's worked really in their advantage in some ways. And then we've seen a lot of really high profile times where that's blown up on them.
Well, scandals aside, you can take those and set them aside. Rodney King, Rampart, the other, however many other ones you want to talk about and to what level you want to consider them a scandal. That all aside, Los Angeles is considered a premier police department and a department to model oneself after. Now, I think a lot of departments in saying that would model themselves after the ideal Los Angeles, right? And try to avoid some of the same mistakes. But I mean, in Spokane, we wore the same uniform. A lot of the department structures are structured very similarly. A lot of people's understanding of police work that's not East Coast police work comes from TV shows all of which are set and filmed in Los Angeles. I think you make a wonderful point, Steve, and I think it is interesting that maybe they are, in good ways and bad, a result of their rapid expansion.
I think they were one of the first departments too to go away from revolvers. I'm pretty sure they were one of the first departments to do SWAT. SWAT was invented by one of their chiefs. I can't remember. I can picture his face too. The fact that I know the name of a
Daryl Gates
chief. Yeah, that's
Daryl
right.
Gates is who you're thinking of. Yeah.
And so many cutting edge things have come out of that department. I mean, Crash, really, if you think that was a very cutting edge program. And I think any program, it can go really well, it can go really bad, depending on what happens in it, where it is in its evolution. Crash and these programs worked pretty well when they were first instituted. If you're not managed properly, anything can go down the drain.
Yeah, I mean, they had to do something in the 80s that with the crack explosion in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. I guess through all of greater Southern California and any heavily populated area, something had to be done. And so they innovated and they created a unit, and it was very effective. And unfortunately, over time, it wasn't, as you very well point out, it was not, they didn't pay close attention, and they'd had a lot of mission drift, let's say, as evidenced by the Rampart scandal. But I know you want to talk about colors, but before we move to that, did you have a favorite quote from the movie? Because I don't really have one. I haven't seen the movie. I don't remember one from the book. I don't know if Chris does, but I'm sure you do.
No, I don't.
That's one. When I was watching it, I think one of the things that stood out is Kilvinsky, who was played by George C. Scott. He had his Kilvinsky's laws, and he was one of those guys who would always, he'd have all of his sayings. And his one saying was, I can't say this one on the air. Well, I mean, I'll fill you in. I think people can fill in the blanks. Take a look at the streets. There'll always be another ass. The thing,
our code for that was Adam Henry.
It was teaching Failure that you can't be an avenging angel. You're not going to solve every crime. You're not going to make the world safe on your shift. You're going to punch out and you're going to punch back in tomorrow. And it's going to be we had a saying in the one job, SSDD, same stuff, different day.
Yeah, there's a lot of variations of that in police work too. That saying that you just quoted, it actually kind of mirrors the lesson that the central lesson that Robert Duvall tries to teach Sean Penn in Colors, right? With his bull story. But it is a veteran guy trying to teach a young guy that you're not going to change the world. You're certainly not going to change it all today. And you're not going to catch every bad guy. Every game is not a Stanley Cup final. You sometimes it's just, you punch the clock like Kilvinsky said.
And we're going to wrap up today's episode right here. But if you enjoy what you're hearing, come and check us out on part 2 of this episode. While you're waiting, it would be great if you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. Go like us on our Facebook page and group and all of our other social media. You can find all of that and more at beyondthebigscreen.com. We'll talk to you next time.